Okay, so we're actually going to start our tour of the North End, not in the North End, but actually facing a construction site and a variety of government buildings that make up Government Center. This is City Hall, but this is hard to sort of picture it now, but this was a neighborhood. It was a neighborhood called the West End. And the West End extended from the back of Beacon Hill down the slope of, like I said, the back, meaning facing this way, facing northeast of Beacon Hill, sloping down toward what's today Cambridge Street, and encompassed this whole area here. Now, the West End was mostly created by filling in a tidal flat called Mill Pond in the 1820s, because the North End was becoming overcrowded and overpopulated. So the West End was where people moved to from the North End for the most part, and I know we're doing this in reverse because we're going to go to the North End, but it's where people moved to for a little bit more space, a little bit better and more sanitary living conditions. It wasn't as fancy and as expensive as Beacon Hill, where the Protestant elite moved to first and lived. It was poorer. The West End, especially the back part of Beacon Hill, which still exists, although now it's just Beacon Hill. You wouldn't know it was the less expensive part. Today, the whole backside of the hill is just Beacon Hill, but it was the West End at the time, and you can even see still some remnants of that, some evidence of that. There's one particular building that has a sort of a copper nameplate that I think says West End Butcher. It's in the middle of, looks like it's in the middle of Beacon Hill, but it's actually on the backside that was considered the West End. And in that neighborhood, Boston's free black community before the Civil War lived, and the black community lived in the West End right up until the 1950s. And it was a neighborhood where immigrants who first moved to the North End in significant numbers, Irish, then Jewish, then Italian, moved to while the black community was continually living there. So what happened? Why is this here today? Well, in the 1950s, the city government and the Boston Redevelopment Authority declared the neighborhood a slum, seized it by eminent domain, and bulldozed it completely to build these government buildings and also to expand MGH, Mass General Hospital, which was there, but they built what MGH looks like today. And so today, the West End, which is now commonly known as Beacon Hill, but the only sort of remainders of the West End are the backside of Beacon Hill, and it just stops abruptly at Cambridge Street, right? And it just becomes this and that giant hospital, MGH. But like I said, this was a thriving community. It was a working class community. It was, at the time, in the 1950s, when it was seized, mostly black and Jewish, and people lived together, and they themselves saw it as a thriving community. And the experience in the West End, which, by the way, you can hear sort of one story about it. Leonard Nimoy, the guy who played Spock in the Star Trek movies, he's Jewish, and he grew up in the West End, and there's the Wexler Oral History Project that records different stories about people who grew up mainly in Yiddish-speaking communities in the United States. He tells a sort of story of his life growing up in the West End. But, the way he tells it is that it may have been poor, but it was not a slum. It was a thriving working class community, but one that was bulldozed to pave way for the expansion of the city. You can still see a couple of remnants of West End Jewish life. On Cambridge Street, there's a building called the Puffers Building, which was the Jewish cigar makers union building. Also within the area around MGH, there's sort of this one old building sandwiched in there, which was the YMHA, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, a communal place of after-school activity and communal life for the Jewish community, along with a trade school that was called Hecht House, that started in the North End and moved to the West End. So the West End also is important because it became a lesson for other communities and other neighborhoods in what the city could do by using eminent domain, really for neighborhoods it wanted the land for redevelopment. It became an example of something to avoid, and other communities, for example, Chinatown, the Puerto Rican community in the South End, use this example of what could happen, so the worst redevelopment and how a neighborhood could just be razed to successfully resist the encroachment of the city. And from here, we will walk towards the North End. For those of you who are not from the Boston area, who have not heard of the Big Dig, the Big Dig was the most expensive highway project in American history. $8 billion to put essentially the central arteries, the major highways, the 93 and the Mass Pike, that before were running through the city, underground, right, to cut congestion in the city. But of course, it took much longer than anyone anticipated. There were major cost overruns. And so this has become sort of Massachusetts' most famous white elephant. And it actually, in a lot of ways, in my opinion, prevents some crucial infrastructure improvement that's needed, expansion of public transit and other major infrastructure projects, because it sort of like hangs over Massachusetts as this lesson in overly expensive infrastructure projects. It's at $8 billion. Right here was a highway. The 93, which now, there was no Sacko Bridge, and the 93, which now goes underground and comes out on the other side of the city, cut right through here. It was called the Central Artery. This was physically a highway. And one of the interesting things about what the 93 did going through, right through downtown, was to cut off the North End from the city itself. You could still get downtown from the North End, but you were navigating, it was a raised highway, and there were frontage streets underneath. And to go from one side to the other, you were crossing this frontage street underneath a giant highway. And people still went to the North End. It was a great place to go for restaurants. I think that the highway itself actually did a lot to preserve the Italian character of the neighborhood and as a functioning neighborhood, because it was so inaccessible from downtown. And I distinctly remember when this was pulled down in the 2000s, a lot of discontent. I mean, you would think, look at this, it's gorgeous. There's now this beautiful park, and you can just easily walk back and forth from downtown. So you would think that residents of the North End would be absolutely delighted. But I recall, and I don't know how much this was the majority opinion or anything, I'm just anecdotally recall that a lot of residents of the North End, longtime residents of the North End, weren't happy about this because there was so much more foot traffic and parking problems and the connection to the city. They felt that it had just become another downtown appendage, right? Rather than a separate, unique neighborhood with its own character. In any event, it is very convenient to take 93 under the city right now. Connecting it to the Pike and the Sumner and Ted Williams tunnels to the airport is really convenient. And this is a lovely park. And I think actually the North End is one of my favorite neighborhoods in Boston. So I think it really still has preserved its character. It's worth sort of imagining this neighborhood as it existed if this was a highway, right? A major highway with a frontage road underneath. It was cut off. And so that's really quite a big change in the neighborhood from the past 20 years. All right, so we have made it to the North End. We're at one of the two streets that are often associated as sort of the entrance to part of the North End. We're at Hanover, and the next street over is Salem, although Commercial Street goes all the way around the outside. So the North End is really Boston's first neighborhood, right? It's the Boston that was established when European colonists first start building homes, right? In Boston itself, after moving over from Charlestown, right? Do people remember why Boston was so important as a site, why people thought Boston was a good place to start a town, and why it ended up being the central town within New England, even a city-state or an empire? Justin?
Harbor.
The harbor, right? The harbor. And the North End, right, just on that far side, actually all the way around this way, is where those first wharves were built, where the ships would come in, where the shipbuilding industry began, building a domestic shipbuilding industry, right? This was where the city started. As a neighborhood, it was very democratic in the sense that all sorts of different people lived in the North End in the 17th century. Think of what Professor Peterson, what Professor Parsons talked about, the sheer number of colonists, thousands of colonists coming over from England in the 18th century, the need for them to find places to live, and fairly rapid expansion of the town. It was all sorts of people who were coming to live here, right? Artisans and craftspeople, people who were lawyers, slaves, indentured servants. There was a diverse sort of socioeconomic profile of the people who lived in 17th and 18th century Boston and primarily lived here. So the North End is associated still for a lot of the revolutionary associations, right? Paul Revere's house is here. The Old North Church is here, which we will go up to talk about. Also events leading up to the revolution, which we'll hear about in Professor Schlereth's talk, in terms of the protests and riots against the Stamp Act and the attacks on the Customs House, which were here. So that it has this revolutionary association. It also has the colonial association, right? From the 17th century, I mentioned this being the origins of the city and where it began to be built up. The Reverend Cotton Mather's own house was roughly located where Mike's Pastry is. And notably, that was where the first experiments with smallpox inoculation within the city began, because Cotton Mather owned a slave from West Africa who told him about the process of inoculation against smallpox by spreading a little bit of pus to make children sick in advance and have them build up immunity. That was utilized within the Massachusetts Bay Colony to inoculate the population from smallpox. So people lived together. So I just said a word about the Revolutionary Association of the neighborhood and a word about the Colonial Association of the neighborhood. But what I really want to talk about as we go around this neighborhood is its role in the immigrant history of this city, in the city of Boston. I mean, of course, the colonists were also immigrants, right? Before the American Revolution, that whole period of 140 years, the people who were coming to what was the Massachusetts Bay Colony were also immigrants. But I want to focus on 19th century immigration to the North End, the period when this neighborhood had become very inexpensive because it was perceived as too dense, not sanitary, and not a desirable place to live, right? By the 1820s, when Mill Pond had been filled in, Boston was growing. Beacon Hill was an expensive neighborhood. Where the Common is and the area around the Common is. Well, Back Bay is filled in later. We'll get there. But the city is growing. People are moving out. Protestants is the key thing. Protestants are moving out into places of better accommodations and better places to live. And this place becomes a place that absorbs Catholic and Jewish immigrants. So the first major wave of Catholic immigrants comes with the Irish, especially in the 1840s. And this neighborhood, the North End, becomes a predominantly Irish neighborhood and a predominantly Catholic neighborhood. The Irish themselves start to move out because this is one of the things with the North End. Until about the 1920s, when electricity and plumbing and sanitation and everything improves, it's not a very nice place to live, right? So when people can move out, they do. Jews start to move in the 1870s and the 1880s, and there's a sort of transition. There are these transitions. It's both an Irish and a Jewish neighborhood. And then the Irish start to move out to other neighborhoods, and it becomes an almost entirely Jewish neighborhood. But almost the second, by around the turn of the 20th century, by almost the second, it's a mainly Jewish community. Catholic migrants, again, this time from Italy, are moving in. And it becomes a majority Italian neighborhood, and almost entirely Italian by the 1920s. And it's preserved that Italian identity since the 1920s. I think part of it, like I said, had to do with the fact that around that time, by the 1920s and 1930s, it became a somewhat more livable place because of plumbing and electricity and things like that. But it's maintained that Italian identity since. And this can, create some tension sometimes. Professor Blatt mentioned Christopher Columbus Park, right? Which is on the water just over there, which is a beautiful park right on the water. And in the late 1970s, as Italians in the neighborhood wanted a symbol to affirm their rootedness, their identity, their sense of ownership over this community, they erected a statue to Christopher Columbus, a person that they adopted as somebody who represented the earliest Italian immigrant, right? And I'm not talking here in terms of factual accuracy, let's say, of how Columbus perceived himself or how he would relate to the Italian community today. It's not really relevant. The relevant thing is that as Italian Americans in cities within the United States became confident and sought to assert their own separate identity, Columbus becomes a symbol because he's somebody who tied, in their minds, Italians to the very discovery of the United States and overcame this sort of idea that Italians were an immigrant community, that their place in the United States was something that could be challenged in any way. And so we're going to go to a few spots to talk about the Irish, Jewish, and Italian phases of this neighborhood. So the two major commercial arteries of the North End are Hanover Street, where we are, and Salem Street, which is one major street, although it's not that major. They're narrow streets over this way. As you can see, this is sort of a lively center of the Italian community here with some great pastry shops and cafes, etc. On Hanover Street, I'm going to talk mostly about the Italian community, and I'm going to talk mostly about the Jewish community on Salem Street, although during the period when this was predominantly a Jewish neighborhood, Jews lived in all of these buildings. So this building over here, called the Cockerell Building, I believe, was where the first Jewish synagogues within the North End, not within the city of Boston, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but within the North End were established. And within the North End, during the period of Jewish migration, there were very few purpose-built buildings, right, for cultural and religious purposes. There was one large synagogue that was built, but for the most part, churches were converted and people squeezed in. The first synagogue was established here in 1875. Another congregation moved in, and they merged to also create within the same building a Hebrew school, or what's called a Talmud Torah, a place where Jewish kids could have sort of basic Jewish education. The merger of those two congregations was called Shomrei Shabbos, and it was right in this building here. The other building I can't help but point out is above the corner store there, right, was a matzah factory. What is matzah? Matzah is a cracker that is baked for ritual purposes in the spring during the holiday of Passover, which tends to in time roughly correspond with Easter. But this just sort of reflects that when people move into the neighborhood, they take ownership over the neighborhood, not in a literal sense, but they turn it into their own community. They establish religious and ritual necessities, their synagogues, their schools, and of course, those things that make the ritual things that they need, matzah, right? So on the second floor above the corner store was the matzah factory for the neighborhood. All right, we're going to keep going down Hanover Street to 383. So as we were coming in to the neighborhood, I was talking a bit about how in the late 1970s, Italian Americans started to sort of positively affirm their identity and their place within American society by elevating this holiday of Columbus Day. And you can see there's a sign over there that says Italian American Heritage Month, and also by taking on the figure of Columbus as the original Italian American hero, rooting Italian society in the United States from the beginning, from before there was even the United States. This has become a little bit difficult terrain given what the association is between Columbus and the colonial settlement of the Americas in general. And actually, I just heard on the radio this morning that acting mayor Kim Janey designated Monday, which is Columbus Day, as Indigenous Peoples Day. And many Italians are upset because they see this as a replacement of their holiday, their celebration of their particular community with that of another. Although the mayor hasn't actually said that it won't be Columbus Day, rather that Monday will be Indigenous Peoples Day. So whether these two holidays can coexist or one replaces the other, remains to be seen. But in particular, Columbus Park became a site of contestation. Beginning in the 2000s, I think in 2006, 2007, Columbus started to get defaced with paint. Just last year in 2020, the statue was decapitated. As a result of it being decapitated, it was removed, and there's sort of an ongoing debate about what should be there, whether it should be repaired and placed elsewhere, or whether there should be a monument either to slavery or to the indigenous history of the Shawmut Peninsula. That is unresolved, although I believe the governor has said that the statue is not going to go back to where it was. But that just gives you a little bit of an idea of the sort of continued tensions over identity that really are still contested even in these ethnic communities. To sort of fully understand the whole phenomenon of Italians embracing Columbus as a sort of national hero, or Italian Americans, I should say, as a sort of precursor to the Italian American community, to root them from the very founding, from the discovery. You have to sort of understand how deep the resistance was among Protestants to Italian migration, to the United States in general, but in Boston in particular. We're going to do a unit on the Sacko and Vanzetti trial, which is maybe the preeminent controversy that highlighted resistance to Italian migration. So who were Sacko and Vanzetti, and what was their trial all about? Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were both Italian immigrants who came to the United States, were laborers, and in the wake of a paymaster at a shoe factory being robbed, were accused of the murder. Sorry, I left that point out. Robbed and murdered on the way to deposit the pay for the workers. Sacco and Vanzetti were accused of the murder. They claimed that they were totally innocent. They claimed that they didn't even know each other. There's something else interesting about them. They were both anarchists. They were both involved in radical anarchist politics. This was in 1920, and there was multiple years trials in which, in 1927, they were eventually executed by electric chair. But for the purposes of this tour, the important thing is the extent to which it revealed deep anti-Catholic and anti-Italian sentiment among the Protestant population. It also revealed a deep fear of radicalism, right? This was 1920. This was only a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution and still in the process of the Civil War in Russia, the consolidation of Soviet rule. And, there were socialist and radical politics that were popular in many parts of Europe, especially in Italy. And there was a deep fear that was added on to the sort of religious animosity about the suspicions of Catholics' allegiance to a foreign power, meaning the Pope, right? And whether they could ever really become American by having full allegiance to a country rather than a religious leader. On top of all of that, Sacko and Vanzetti trial revealed this association with the fear of radicalism as well, the danger of it harming the American state from the inside. This trial was huge. It was a truly global event. There were protests against the unfair trial throughout Europe, right? Which of course led Americans, especially Protestant Americans, to dig in and to take, further anti-radical and anti-immigrant positions as they saw themselves being, unfairly tarred by radicals and foreigners abroad. And in particular, it affected the judgment and the case itself. The case, we will never know that, whether Sacko and Vanzetti actually murdered this paymaster. You can ask Professor Temkin. Somebody does always. Do you think he did it? He doesn't have the answer. Nobody really knows. There's been all sorts of, ballistic revisiting, etc. It's possible it was one of them, not the other. We'll never know whether they did it or not. But the trial itself was absolutely unfair. The prejudice of the judges was completely clear. There was plenty of record of them harboring deep anti-Catholic resentment, that the judge himself had no interest in conducting a fair trial. And that's what led to this reaction against it, because it was seen, whether Sacko and Vanzetti did it or not, they were perceived to be persecuted because of where they came from and who they were. And it's very possible that the counter-protests, the radical protests, the socialist protests, and the anarchist protests against the Sacko and Vanzetti trial that took place abroad, and the sort of tarring and questioning of American democracy and the American legal system that people were aware of here, led to an even harsher result, right? Not everybody was being executed in 1927 in these sorts of circumstances, but Sacko and Vanzetti were. So they had their funeral here, and there was a funeral procession that left Hanover Street right here, and over 10,000 people, mainly Italians from the North End, followed the funeral procession all the way to Forest Hills in Jamaica Plain, where the cemetery is. It was considered a devastating loss for the Italian community, largely because it was felt as an indictment of them, that there was animosity against them because of who they were as a community. It takes time for communities to come to feel that they're at a place where they can affirm their own identity. And this really starts in the 1960s and the 1970s with the Black Power movement and African Americans feeling that they should positively affirm their identity. And other ethnic communities start to do the same and start to seek to root their history and their place and their identity in neighborhoods like this, and holidays and statues, etc., and Italian American Heritage Month. But it's important to remember that it simply wasn't always easy, right? That there was a process, and we're going to talk in the class about periods of deep anti-Asian, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish sentiment and resistance to migration in this city. It's a city that is really very much made up from waves of immigrants, right? But in each of these waves, there's been deep resistance. All right, so we're going to head over to Salem Street and talk about the Jewish community and then the Irish community. All right, so we are at the site of the Old North Church right here, which is one of the famous sites associated with the American Revolution and the Freedom Trail. It's where many of the American revolutionaries plotted the events that would become the revolution. It's where Paul Revere began his famous ride, and where signals were made whether the British troops had left Boston, one if by land, two if by sea. So one lantern meant they were going west, and two meant they were going to Charlestown. It's a really interesting spot, but it's actually not what I want to discuss, even though I just did. Right? I want to discuss this little building over here. All of this stuff requires money to maintain, et cetera. And there's an Old North Foundation, raises money and gets grants and things like that to maintain these historic sites. And in the early 2000s, there was interest from the Mars Chocolate Company about using this building here, Clow House, as a building to help to tell the story of the history of chocolate. It was sort of a historic and a promotional type idea. And they wanted to give it a name for a person, or to name it after a person who was associated with chocolate and associated with the site. So they found somebody who was associated with both of those things. His name was Captain Newark Jackson, who was apparently a cocoa smuggler, and they decided to create a chocolate store called Captain Jack's that would both sell chocolate to raise money for the Old North Church and at the same time tell the history of chocolate. Fast forward a few years and people start doing some research into who Captain Jackson was, what he was doing smuggling chocolate, what and who else he might have smuggled. And actually, one of our guests to the class, Jared Hardesty, his new book, which is called Mutiny on the Rising Sun, tells the story of Captain Jack's murder, or Jackson's murder, in a mutiny off of the coast of Suriname. And because Captain Jackson was murdered in this mutiny off the coast of Suriname, which was a Dutch colonial possession, there was something of an investigation into what happened, and records turned up, right? And the story revealed itself. And Captain Jackson absolutely smuggled cocoa or cacao, but he also smuggled slaves. He wasn't just a slave owner, he was smuggling slaves and slave children from the West Indies and West Africa to the United States. And cargo of this ship actually included 13 slave children that died in this mutiny. And what Professor Hardesty really does in this book, from what I understand, is to reveal the importance and the connections of smuggling and slavery in colonial and revolutionary America. And this caused a bit of a reckoning about the shop and the use of this name. After a few years, it was decided not to use this name because of its associations. So Jews started to move from Eastern Europe into the North End beginning in the 1870s, and it really picked up in the 1880s and 1890s. This East European Jewish community that moved into the North End was not the first Jewish community in the city. The first Jewish community in the city was based mainly around the what's today the Theater District, but was what was the old South End before land was filled in to create the new South End. And this was German Jews who moved here in the 1840s and 1850s and were very involved in the retail trades. Now, much of the narrative of Eastern European Jewish migration to the United States is based on this idea that Jews were fleeing anti-Jewish violence in the Russian Empire, especially pogroms. People might have heard this term, mob violence. And that is something that certainly did occur, and this was a place that, especially beginning in 1881, was making life increasingly difficult for Jews to live there. But most historians at this point see this migration as fundamentally an economic migration. Jews are moving from Eastern Europe to the United States to work in industries right, that were growing, primarily working for those German Jews who came before them, right? So if you think of many of the sort of the department stores that exist in the United States, not just in Boston and in New York, but also in the Midwest, which today the Midwest, but was then the West, right? Many of them sound like they have German names. Many of these were founded by German Jewish families. Those families that became involved in the retail trade, right, they wanted produce, not fruit produce, but they wanted products to sell, and they wanted to be able to produce them cheaply, especially textiles, right? Clothing, furniture, shoes, right? And for that production, and that was becoming increasingly industrialized at the end of the 19th century, they wanted cheap labor. And Jews were able to use their networks, right, their social, commercial, and familial networks to recruit immigrants to come, right? And that's the way much of the migration worked, right? The families that were already here and were already established, right, would send agents to Eastern Europe to recruit people to come and work in the factories that they were establishing, right? They would subsidize or pay for their tickets, right? And once they were here, they would meet them down at the docks and find them a place to live until they could get them employment. So this area, for a fairly brief period, from about the 1880s to the 1900s, was a place of where Jews lived, they worked in factories and created textiles right here on these streets, right? And there was a process for absorbing those immigrants. So this building here was the Women's Jewish Settlement House, right? Many people came over as families, but people also came over single, right? And people would live there very cheaply for just long enough that they could find a job, right? And then rent something somewhere or rent a room somewhere. Right around the corner, here it says Siegel, right? This is the Siegel building. This was both a wholesale and a manufacturing building, right? And today we would probably call these a sweatshop, right? It's a place where large numbers of people were working in close conditions to manufacture textiles, and then people would come to other floors, retailers would come to other floors to purchase those wholesale textiles. But this whole neighborhood was filled with sort of all levels of production and life, right? So people were often working where they were living or living where they were working, right? The whole production process would be divided up into stages, right? In one apartment, there might be 10 people who were living there, and they would be responsible for cutting the coats, right? And another one, it would be people responsible for sewing the pieces of the coats together. Another one for putting buttons on, etc. And anybody have any guess who would be responsible for shuttling these products at the various stages of production from one of these buildings to another? Any guesses? No guesses? Children. That was one of the jobs that children did. When at certain times of the day, they would, let's say, pick up the cut textile and bring it to the next place to be sewed together, and the stuff that had been sewed together to the next place for the finishes. And so, part of the story of Jews leaving the neighborhood, right? On the one hand, they went to the West End, they went to other parts of the city because, like I said before, this was not a terribly pleasant place to live, right? It was overcrowded, it was smelly, there was just terrible sanitation, there wasn't indoor plumbing in most cases. So people wanted to live and go out and live in better conditions whenever they could. But the economy of the place also changed, right? Around the turn of the 20th century, like I said, the economy of this place would be, there would be textiles being made in various stages of production, finished, sold in wholesale stores, and sold in retail stores as well. As the owners of the companies that were purchasing these finished goods start to scale up their production, right, they build bigger factories, right? And they move those factories to other parts of the city, to East Boston especially, to Chelsea, right? So by the 1920s, Chelsea is a majority Jewish city, right? And most of the Jewish manufacturing has moved to Chelsea. So there is this transition within the neighborhood that goes on from Jewish to Italian. That's a combination of factors. Partly, like I said, people are moving on. They're looking for better space and better living conditions and making room for new immigrants who are looking for cheap housing. But partly the economy of the place is changing as well, right? As factories are moving out of this densely populated area. Like I said at the beginning when I pointed out the first synagogue congregation, most of the synagogues that were built here were not actually built here, they were repurposed buildings. And this area around here, the street, one little alleyway over, it's still called Jerusalem Place. It's not really even a street, but rather an alley. Those buildings don't exist anymore, but this area around here was the religious center, right? This is where, around the turn of the 20th century, most of the synagogues were located. And on Baldwin Place was the one large synagogue that was purpose-built as a synagogue within the neighborhood and continued to operate until the 1940s. And was this was a center of a more religious, more traditional, more orthodox community that was right here. I just also want to say, I mentioned funeral homes. It's not a terribly interesting building or door or anything like that, but 5 Cooper Street up there, that was the location, not of the funeral home, but what was called the Chevra Kadisha. So within Eastern European Jewish culture, being responsible for preparing the dead for burial was a very important communal role and was actually one of great power, right? Because to deny somebody a proper burial because they didn't pay their taxes to the community, right? Their sort of special community taxes, or they were a social outcast, or they did something problematic, compared to whatever the normative practice was. This was a thing of power to be able to deny burial. And so the people who controlled what was called the Chevra Kadisha, which literally means holy society, were generally the elite within a given place, right? Well, in the United States, it's not that there was no elite, but it was a clean slate, right? And they had to recreate these sort of communal institutions and did so in a sort of more democratic way. But also certain families took on the role the way other communities did, like with it was later, but with the Langone family, with the funeral home, they took on the role of sort of professionalizing preparation and burial of the dead, right? So the Chevra Kadisha ends up getting run by a family called the Stanetsky family, right? Who start a funeral home in the location of this Chevra Kadisha. And that's still a family that's in the funeral business, burying a lot of Jewish people in Boston. They're no longer in the North End. They're in Brookline, where the Jewish community is more concentrated these days. All right. Let's go. So this is going to be our last stop. We're on the corner of Cooper Street and North Margin Street, and this was the site of the Cooper Street Armory, which was a Union Army armory during the Civil War. And what I want to talk about here is going back in time. We talked about the Italian community, Jewish community, and like I said at the very beginning, sort of the first major non-Protestant community to take ownership over this neighborhood or to see it as its own neighborhood was the Irish, beginning in the 1820s and especially in the 1840s and continuing through the 1860s. And this was the site in 1863, in the summer of 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, of a major anti-draft protest, right? the Irish were being drafted into the Union Army to fight during the Civil War. And, their attitudes to it were complicated, right? I don't think we can sort of simplify and say, there was sort of one single view on the Civil War in any community that was living in the United States. They were, I would say, patriotic and willing to fight for the Union, and did so in enormous numbers, including people who really hadn't been here very long. There were entirely Irish regiments, and many, many died. But there was also a resistance to the idea of the emancipation of slavery, because people were concerned about what that might do with free black migration and the competition for jobs. But more than anything, what the Irish living in the North End were upset about was the sense that Protestants were getting out of serving in the Union Army in the same sorts of numbers. There were laws that were passed that allowed somebody with means to purchase their own or their son's service in the Union Army and have it replaced by somebody else, right? And the Irish, for the most part, in this neighborhood, a poor immigrant neighborhood, didn't have the means to do that. And so they had this feeling that they were being forced to serve in the Union Army in this war in disproportionate numbers and shoulder a disproportionate burden when the Protestant elite were getting out of it. And so in the summer of 1863, there were also draft riots in New York, but right here on Cooper Street was where women played an important role, pulling up paving stones, pulling up rocks, throwing them at the police, throwing them at the army who came to disperse them. And it didn't last very long because it was put down with a very heavy hand, I think uncoincidentally, because this was a Catholic riot. It wasn't a Protestant riot. It wasn't either. It wasn't a religious riot at all. So this riot was put down violently and very quickly, I think because of who it was that was rioting, that it was Irish Catholic rioting. So just to go back to the bigger theme of this tour, going through the neighborhood, this important neighborhood that has absorbed many waves of migration into the city and has gone through phases of being the residents feeling that this is an Irish neighborhood, and then a Jewish neighborhood, and then an Italian neighborhood, as it still is today. It's not always been an easy process, right? In each wave, these groups have created the cultural, religious, political infrastructure for themselves to thrive. They're not always welcome. In fact, they are generally not welcome. And the elite in the city has repeatedly pushed back, and we're going to learn about this, but pushed back and attempted to restrict the migration of these non-Protestant groups into the city of Boston. And so, now Boston has this identity as being a Catholic city, as being a city associated with the Irish. So much of this city has now come to take on this Irish identity. This neighborhood has come to take on this Italian identity, and you see signs for Italian American Heritage Month. But it was not easy, and it took many decades for these different communities to feel that they were equal to the Protestants, that they had an equal share of power and control over the future and the destiny of the city.